Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Raoul. I'm a researcher at Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. I'm specialized in business and human rights, and I'm also interim head of research now. I'll be the moderator of this event, which is co-organized by Raoul Wallenberg Institute and the School of Economics and Management here in Lund. The event is supported by EU Cross project. EU Cross stands for the European Union at the crossroads of global order. This project has an overarching theme as the challenges and opportunities that the European Union faces in time when our conventional understanding of the global order is put into question and multilateralism is contested. The project is a network type of project, so it seeks to stimulate scholarly exchanges between affiliated institutions, and it supports our lecture today. There will be a range of lectures that will be video recorded, which explains that camera on the tripod over there. They will be recorded and uploaded online on YouTube. So in the coming years, if you are interested in 5 themes that are covered by the project, which are trade, sustainable development, migration, counterterrorism, and human rights, you are welcome to check YouTube and EU Cross. So regarding that camera on the tripod there, that raises some questions of compliance with the EU data protection regulation, which, as you know, it's about data security and privacy concerns. So I would like to explain to you a bit more what is recorded here. The presentation from Professor Axel Marx and the comments from Professor Jürgen will be video recorded, of course with audio, so the camera will frame the stage here. When it comes to questions and answers and comments, then it's gonna be only audio, so there will be no video recording of the audience, but it will be audio recorded. So please let us know if you, right now if you have any concerns about this setting. Because, as you know, it's common practice in this type of events that when we make a comment, when we raise a question, we introduce ourselves by name and affiliated institution. So it's totally up to you to introduce yourself like this, but if you have any concerns about privacy and data protection, feel free not to introduce yourself. So I hope that clarifies the entire setting here. About the topic, it's about international trade agreements and their relation to human rights and labor rights. As you know, this has been a highly contested area for all those interested in globalization studies. International trade instruments and policies can have negative impacts on labor rights, on human rights, on the environment as well. This is when economic growth is prioritized against social and environmental concerns. But these trade agreements can also have positive impacts. They can act as a force for change, for a more sustainable and inclusive globalization. So through his address today, Professor Axel Marx will talk about free and fair trade. Is the EU leading the way? So Professor Marx will explain to you how the EU is handling these issues. Indeed, the European Union has committed to modern trade, to a value-based trade agenda. And he will update you on the latest policy developments in the EU, but he will also give you some historical depths in what is a 25 years old discussion and debate about the link between trade and human rights. He will also touch upon approaches developed in US and Canada, and that will offer you a bit of contrast and understand better the EU position. And of course, he will critically reflect on the very recent reform proposals in the European Union, based on the latest empirical findings in research, as well as conceptualization in academic literature. Professor Marx is very well positioned for this ambitious task today. He's a professor at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. His research reveals a keen interest in human rights and labor rights, sustainability standards, trade and investment, market regulation, and global governance. We plan that you will speak for roughly 45 minutes. After that, we will pass the floor to Jürgen Hetzner, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Business Law here at Lund University. He's also Director of the Center for European Studies. He specialized in European Union constitutional law and issues concerning internal market and competition policy. In addition to his academic publications, he also conducted several governmental inquiries regarding the relationship between EU law and Swedish law. He kindly agreed to serve as commentator today on Professor Marx's presentation. We are looking forward to your insights and any reactions you might have to the presentation. We counted on around 15 minutes for your feedback. After that, we will pass the floor to the audience for questions and comments. 45 minutes, 60 minutes, depending how we do. We have planned until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. So with that being said, Axel, the floor is yours. It's a real pleasure to welcome you in Lund today. Please.
Thank you very, very much, Raoul, for this very kind introduction. And thank you all for coming to this lecture. Raoul gave me quite a challenging title in the sense that free and fair trade is the EU leading the way. I don't know if many of you already reflected on that. I will already give you away the conclusion of the talk. And coming from Belgium, which is a country of compromises, my answer to the question will be yes and no. And I will try, during my lecture, try to explain a little bit why I have this, let's say, balanced assessment, but also a bit of a dual feeling about what the EU is doing in terms of its free trade agenda, and more importantly, and which is the topic of today, how it wants to use free trade to pursue, let's say, non-trade objectives. And then mostly we are talking about the protection of human rights, of labor rights, but more in generally also of sustainability, including environmental protection. What I want to do in this lecture is first give you a bit of introduction and context on why we are talking about this. It has already been mentioned, there is economic globalization, which is a driving force, according to some, for the good, creates jobs, creates economic development, but for critics it's also a force for the negative, because it might create some kind of competition between countries to lower environmental standards, to lower labor standards, and so on. That's the context. In this context, the EU developed a strategy, the Trade for All strategy, in which it set out what the EU tries to achieve with its trade policy. And as we will see, in that trade strategy, there's a lot of emphasis, not only on the economic aspects of trade, but also on the non-economic aspects of trade, on issues related to human rights and labor rights. Briefly give that context, and then for the most of the lecture we will delve into how the EU is doing that. How does the EU try to achieve non-trade objectives through its trade instruments? And I will focus on two main trade instruments. One is called GSP. I'm not sure if anybody already heard of GSP, but it's the General System of Preferences. It gives preferential market access to developing countries, and it lowers a lot of tariffs. The other trade instrument the EU is using, it's not unilateral, but it's bilateral free trade agreements. And in both of these instruments, the EU is pursuing this idea of integrating labor rights and human rights. And I will first give a bit of an introduction to how they are doing that. So what are we talking about? What does it mean? And then I will go into an assessment and the challenges of how this approach currently is working. A little note on my perspective. I'm a political scientist by training, and I have what I call an institutional perspective. With that I mean that look at these instruments very much from the perspective of how are they designed. How precise are the commitments in these agreements or in GSP? How are these commitments monitored? What happens if one sees or observes that there is non-compliance with these commitments? Are there any sanctions? And these types of institutional design parameters are the focus of the assessment. Then I will end up with a conclusion trying to bring the different elements together. But first, a little bit of context. In the last 50 years, the volume of trade has increased tremendously. We had the economic crisis in 2008. There was a bit of a slowdown in trade. But before that, trade by far outpaced economic development and created a real global economy. We did not only see an increase in trade just as goods moving across a border, but we also witnessed a very profound change in the nature of trade. And economists refer to that as the emergence of supply chains, which basically means that products nowadays are made in different parts of the world. And they are made in those parts of the world which are, from a cost efficiency point of view, the most interesting parts. So for those parts of a product where there's a lot of labor involved and a lot of labor cost, they are most of the time manufactured in countries where labor costs are relatively low. So that creates a whole type of economic development which now characterizes most of the products we on a daily basis buy. If you take out your laptops, if you take up your mobile phones, they're literally manufactured from parts coming from many different countries. How the trade agenda will develop in the future is, of course, currently a very big outstanding question. You're all aware about the clash between China and the US for the moment and the possible emergence of a trade war. But a lot of that debate, and especially the rhetorics of Trump nowadays, are a backlash for partially against what happened over the last 5 decades with increased globalization. Now, this trade has, as already been mentioned, social, environmental, and human rights impacts. And a lot of countries who want to position themselves in the global economy, who want to grow through exports, who want to be part in those supply chains, might start competing on labor rights, on environmental protection, in order to keep production costs as low as possible. And that might create, as some fear, a race to the bottom. If you have workers work for 70 hours a week, and then the other country goes for 75 hours, you have a race of, some call it exploitation. So it creates, besides positive effects, negative labor and human rights effects. And there are many issues related to that, and we cannot go into them in detail, but they're related to working hours, they're related to exploitation of child labor, they are related to forced labor, and so on. There are many human rights issues involved in this international trade debate. And some of these issues pop up once in a while in the media when we had the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh. 1,300 people died in sweatshop conditions, which was blamed for partially by those companies working at the Rana Plaza to not take into account any safety measures, to not take into account any health measures and so on. Specific companies like Nike have been blamed by NGOs and by others for sourcing products from sweatshops and so on. So there are real serious concerns on trade in relation to human rights. And these concerns are the concerns the EU tries to take into account in its trade agenda. An important point to understand in this respect is that the EU itself is a key actor in trade globally. Some authors, like Sophie Meunier, refer to that as a big power in trade, purely to its market size, just like the US, just like China. The EU has an extremely amount of market power to determine what other parties might do if they want to access the European market. There are major power in trade through the market size, and there are major power in trade, according to some, because of the trade policy that they develop, trade agreements they negotiate, and the trade agenda they want to develop globally. Now, in this trade policy, there also is the EU is also becoming what they call a power through trade. With that, they mean that the EU is trying to use its market size to pursue non-trade objectives in trade relations. And that can go from labor standards to sustainable development policies, to putting other things on the agenda. And the backbone of all that, why the EU is doing that, is fueled by a few aspects. As some critics might say, it's fueled by a protectionist agenda of the EU. The EU actually wants to export their norms and values to protect what they have here. But I think most importantly, or more importantly, to understand what the EU is doing, is also to look at what's written in the EU treaties and what's written in the EU policy documents, where they say that the respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights are crucial for the function of the EU. They are the foundational norms of the EU. And the EU should not only pursue these founding principles internally in how the EU functions, but they should also export these norms. And I'm not an EU lawyer, or an EU lawyer, so you know that better than me, but there are articles which determine to a degree that the EU should pursue this policy of rule of law, human rights protection, and also to a degree sustainable development in all of its external policies. And that includes the trade policies. So there's an agenda of the EU to integrate labor rights and human rights in their trade policy, to prevent a race to the bottom, to maybe protect their own market. But there's also a very strong, let's say, legal backbone to these policies, which are determined in the EU treaties. Now, the EU wants to use its market to force other countries to comply with social standards, with environmental standards, with human rights. And they try to do that in the different types of policy instruments, in which we'll go in some detail in a moment. So they basically want to use their huge market as a bargaining chip to tell other countries, if you want to have access to our market, you have to strengthen labor law, you have to ratify international conventions on human rights, you have to abide by ILO conventions on labor rights. And Chad Demrow of the University of Edinburgh has labeled this process of using its market as a force to change other countries' policies, market power Europe. It wants to use its market to externalize its social, environmental, and human rights standards. So that's the context, what the EU tries to do, in which they operate. And they are now, of course, have to translate that into real policies. And if you want to have an interesting read on what the overall policy objectives are, you can download that document from the Commission website, and it's called Trade for All, towards a more responsible trade and investment policy. It was developed by the start of this Commission, by Malmström, and it sets out the guiding lines and principles of the EU's trade policy. And as you can expect, of course, there's a lot on that document on the trade objectives the EU wants to achieve, especially in relation to creating more jobs through the export of products, trying to have better quality jobs by being more integrated in a global economy. Also deal with new economic realities which the EU has to confront, especially e-commerce, the fact that you can buy goods all over the world and have it in less than 24 hours. Issues related to privacy, as Raoul in his introduction mentioned on the GDPR, that plays out in a lot of trade issues and so on. Strong objectives related to transparency, that we do not have trade as some kind of a secret economic game where we negotiate in shady rooms on certain products, tariffs, and so on, but that we have a clear overview of who is doing what. These are the more classical aspects of the trade policy. But the fourth aspect, and which is very prominent in the document, is the value-based trade policy. And there it lays out what it actually means by pursuing non-economic objectives in trade, and what it means by doing power to trade in a sense of having a foreign policy through trade policy. And if you read through that document, you will notice an enormous amount of emphasis on labor rights and human rights, besides environmental protection, and on the whole idea of promoting good governance, fighting corruption, installing the rule of law, and so on. More recently, there's also, of course, quite a bit of emphasis on the SDGs, because that's becoming the overall framework. But that's what the EU tries to do. Specific focus is on promoting and defending human rights, and doing that in all of the instruments it has. And I will go into that in a second. Final element, as I just mentioned, the very strong emphasis on fighting corruption and promoting good governance, and that has a lot to do with the investment part of the trade and investment policy, in order to make sure that European investors who go all over the world are protected for their investments, and which inter alia go into the whole system of protecting investors through the investment growth system as the EU is currently proposing. Now, let's try to go a bit in more detail in what does this now mean in practice. I will first talk about the GSP, and then I will talk about the bilateral trade agreements. And I will briefly say what they are and how the EU brings in human rights. And then we go into what are the debates on that. The GSP is actually a quite simple system. It's what we call a unilateral system. So it's only from the perspective of the EU. And it gives preferential market access to goods coming from developing countries. With preferential market access, we mean that there are no or much lower tariffs. Normally, when you have a good coming in your country, when it crosses the border, you need to pay a tariff. Some of you might follow now the whole debate on Brexit and the Irish border. A lot of that plays in there. Normally, if you're the EU is an integrated market, but for all the products coming from outside to the EU, in the EU, a tariff needs to be paid. In its GSP scheme, the European Union says, well, for some products, you don't have to pay tariffs. Making these products cheaper, making these products more demanded on the European market, and providing an incentive for development in those countries where these products are made. And the whole idea is, a bit as some of you might have heard of aid for trade, is to developing countries to promote them more economically. The whole idea is to have developing countries develop economically by allowing more export. If you have to pay tariffs to enter the EU, you might export less. If tariffs fall away, you might export more, creating more demand, creating more economic activity. And in this GSP scheme, the EU distinguishes three schemes. One is the standard GSP, and that gives a reduction on tariffs of almost around on 70 products. But a very interesting scheme from our perspective tonight is the GSP Plus scheme. If you as a country are included in the GSP Plus scheme, you get tariff reductions on more than 90% of your products. And for the least developed countries, there's the Everything But Arms scheme, where you have zero tariffs on all products except related to arms. So the EU gives a bit of the carrot of market access to these countries. But it does not do so unconditionally. In order to be able to be eligible for GSP, and GSP Plus more specifically, the country needs to ratify and implement 27 international conventions. And they all relate to human rights, labor rights, or the environment. And there's one convention on combating corruption. So if the country wants to have free access to the EU market, it has to make an international commitment, and it has to ratify those conventions. These are the 15 first conventions in this GSP regulation. There's a bit of a technical issue there. The GSP regulation has 27 conventions. And the 15 first ones are what they call the core ones, because they also apply to EBA and the GSP system in general. And then you have 12 additional ones, mostly related to environment, which only apply to the GSP plus countries. But all these conventions have to be ratified by the country. So the country really has to make a very strong commitment to comply with ILO Convention on Labor Rights Issues, or to comply with human rights conventions. And the EU does not only ask them to ratify these conventions, but also to implement them. And it tries to monitor quite extensively how that's being done. They monitor that through looking at the different secretariats of these conventions, who also have reporting and monitoring systems. What are they saying about these GSP plus countries and these conventions? They do it through EU delegations, they do it through NGOs and so on. And theoretically, if countries are not implementing or complying with the conventions, the EU can withdraw them from the GSP preferences. So possibly hurting them economically by reinstalling tariffs on products. These are all the different countries in the different schemes. Now, what are the key challenges with this scheme? Because on paper, it looks like quite a strong instrument. You get access to the European market, you can export more, but in return you have to comply with these conventions. And the key challenge is, of course, to foster compliance with these conventions, because countries might have different incentives not to comply with them. And then when we think about complying with these conventions, and we have a look at, for instance, the GSP plus countries, you might see that not all of them are, of course, leaders when it comes to human rights or labor rights protection. To give you an obvious example, the Philippines. Some of you who are following what's happening in the Philippines, but there are blatant human rights violations by the current president. If you read Human Rights Watch reports, you read Amnesty reports, you just read media reports, you will see that there are many people are being killed in this war on drugs. Some say that it's the worst human rights crisis since the 70s and 80s under Marcos, and that was already a very brutal regime. So there are very serious concerns about how well the Philippines are complying with these conventions. Duarte also said that he was going to throw out United Nations officials. He wants to withdraw from the United Nations and so on. So, but that's a country which is currently in the GSP plus scheme. So that might already ring a first bell in the sense that if the aim is to have better compliance with international conventions, and on the other hand you see these types of observations, what does that tell you about the effectiveness of such a scheme? That might not be so effective in the sense that might not comply or force countries to comply. An obvious answer might be why the Commission is to withdraw the tariff preferences and have a sanction on the Philippines. But the sanction mechanism in GSP is actually quite hard, because you might create more poverty, you might create more harm by isolating a country economically. That's actually also why the Commission does not use sanctions under GSP much. So far, it has only used it 3 times. In the case of Belarus, for violations on the Convention of Freedom of Association, in Sri Lanka, and in Myanmar. And actually, especially in relation to Belarus, the Commission regularly argues that putting sanctions on Belarus did not improve the situation there, but made it worse. So it's a very difficult balancing act on the use of sanctions as an instrument to address non-compliance. Besides these blatant forms of non-compliance, there's also the issue in the GSP scheme of what we would call more gradual implementation challenges. And what with that we mean is that overall countries comply. With that we mean they ratify the conventions and try to live up to a certain degree. But when you go into some more depth, and you look at how these conventions are implemented on the ground, you see that the track record is far less good. And we did quite some work on trying to measure the degree to which the ILO Convention on Freedom of Association and Collective Bargaining is implemented in countries. And I'm not going to go into the methodological detail, but we try to measure to what degree a country implements this convention. And on a scale from 0 to 10, if they implement it well and all the different provisions in there, they reach a score of 10. If they do not implement it well, they reach a score of 0. In this type of measurement, we make a distinction to the degree to which they implement the convention well in legal terms, so translate it into national law, and in the degree to which they really implement it in practice. And in cases of Colombia, what you see is that this is the legal implementation. So legally, they ratify the conventions, they put it into national law, but they do not really enforce it, because the dotted line is the enforcement in practice. That Simmons of Harvard University calls this a bit the false positives. They ratify international conventions to signal to the world that they have ratified it, but they do not really have much of an intention to really implement it. And that can be for many different reasons. It's not always that a country is unwilling to implement it, but they might also do not have the technical and financial capacity to implement it. But it's another part of the challenge of GSP, in the sense that there are a lot of instances, especially in GSP plus countries, where the de facto and practice implementation of these international conventions is far from perfect. So there are many challenges: monitoring, enforcement, sanctioning, not working, and so on. And the question is, what should we do? And what are the current, let's say, debates on addressing that? And there are actually quite a few proposals out there. I will briefly touch on two of them, and they are partially overlapping. One set of proposals comes from a coalition of NGOs, which came together in the GSP platform. And they have developed a whole set of proposals to address what's happening in GSP. First proposal is that in order to address this problem of the gradual implementation challenge, the problem of not really implementing on the ground these international conventions, for each country, the EU should make roadmaps. And in those roadmaps, countries should commit to making changes. For instance, they should commit to have more labor inspectorates every year. They should commit to develop different types of monitoring instruments. They should develop instruments, for instance, which would protect union workers. And once we have those roadmaps, we can regularly assess the progress. Secondly, they want to open up the monitoring process. Currently, the monitoring of the GSP plus countries in terms of how well they are performing on their commitments is done by the Commission, but it's not public. So there are a lot of debates between the Commission and those countries, but it's not known what these debates are about and what the agreements are. And they want to make these types of debates public. Very importantly, they want to have a stronger system where violations can be reported and where a formal complaint can be lodged. So if you are a set of NGOs or concerned citizens or politicians who want to raise the issue of the Philippines, they want to have a formal mechanism where that can take place. And that you then have some kind of a decision-making procedure which would in the end decide on an appropriate sanction what should happen in the case of in this case, the Philippines. And when we think about such a scheme, this platform sees that as a body within the EP, but we can think of other types of systems. But very importantly, linked to that scheme is that we have to think more carefully about different types of sanctions. And here it's the whole debate of having sanctions for a whole country or having more targeted sanctions for specific types of economic actors, political actors, and so on. Currently, the GSP scheme is very much a scheme which operates on the level between the Commission and governments of a state. But when we think about labor rights, when we think about human rights concerns, some of the main actors sometimes are not a state, but are companies in certain countries. And it's very difficult in the way that the scheme currently is designed to target those. And that might be one thing which needs to be taken into account when we're forming GSP. A similar set of proposals was made in a recent report by the European Parliament. And here there's also the whole idea of having roadmaps, having more close monitoring, but there is more emphasis here on involving also non-state actors, NGOs, and so on in this process, and to develop some kind of system where progress is tracked of these GSP plus countries in relation to the protection of labor rights and human rights. And all these proposals very much come from a logic of having, let's say, a process approach to making sure that countries which are gaining from this type of system are always, let's say, followed up in terms of their compliance with these international conventions. Some might object that it's maybe, let's say, too imperialistic of the Commission to really have this very strong follow-up and really tell countries what they need to do and so on. On the other hand, if you have a system in place where you want to use your market to foster changes in a third country, you also need to design it in such a way that it results in credible outcomes and that you really observe a better, let's say, adherence to international conventions. Also in this report, there's a lot of focus on targeted sanctions and not sanctioning a whole country by excluding it from the GSP scheme. And in the discussion, we might want to return to that topic because that's one of the key questions out there. How can you devise a system in such a way which fosters positive change within a country without resorting to very strong sanctions? And in the EP report, they go in quite some detail on what these targeted sanctions could be. That could be focusing on specific sectors, for instance, like the textile sector in Bangladesh, to even going to blacklist specific companies which violate labor rights and put them on some kind of a blacklist so that they do not get any export licensing anymore. But this is a whole set of proposals which actually goes a bit against this logic which I just said about the Commission talking to a state, but really within a state targeting different types of economic actors and their alleged or real violations of some of these rights. So that's what the EU tries to do in its GSP scheme. That's one instrument. You allow people into your market, and in return you ask them to comply with conventions. The whole human rights and labor rights issue also plays out in bilateral trade agreements. So, just to situate for you, the GSP system is mostly for developing countries. When we shift towards more middle income countries or high income countries, like Peru and so on, the EU is not using the GSP scheme, but they are using bilateral trade agreements. And especially also when we think about countries like South Korea, when we think about countries like Japan and others, the EU also has a lot to gain for exporting to those countries. So there, they use the more traditional instrument of a trade agreement. And also in those trade agreements, they have a strong emphasis on human rights and labor rights. And that plays out in two components. One is what we call the essential elements clauses, and the other one is what we call the trade and sustainable development chapters in a trade agreement. A trade agreement is like a contract that has many different chapters, and most of these chapters go about intellectual property, competition, public procurement, specific tariffs for specific products. But since 2011, since the agreement with South Korea, the EU started also to have a chapter on sustainable development, precisely with the aim of having compliance with international commitments. Now, first, very brief on the essential elements. It's important to know that for most of the EU trade agreements, the first article refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that means that's in the first chapter, and it's an essential element of the agreement. And that actually means that if there is, let's say, proof that there is violation of these human rights, the agreement might stop. So the first article might be triggered to stop an agreement. It has never been used so far, but it's quite an important, let's say, aspect of an agreement. And hardcore trade negotiators, I don't think they like it that much to have this type of commitments in, but that's something typically the EU wants in all their agreements. And it might lead to what they call appropriate measures in case of violation. So that's one part. So potentially, trade agreements depend on compliance with human rights conventions. Another part is the trade and sustainable development chapters, which I just mentioned. And they're actually quite extensive chapters in a trade agreement, which in all of the new, since 2011, agreements was integrated. So that's in Korea, Colombia, Peru, Moldova, and so on. And the whole purpose of those chapters is to set up some kind of system in place which makes sure that, in this case, both parties comply with the provisions in the agreement. And if you look through the different agreements, you will see that the language is almost not identical, but very similar. It's all about recognizing the important contribution of trade to sustainable development, but very strong commitment to multilateral agreements, both on the environment and on labor. A commitment from both parties to not engage into a race to the bottom. And especially more recently, there's an element in there which tries to bring in CSR issues and other corporate issues, which makes that both parties agree to develop different types of initiatives which address social and environmental issues. Broadly speaking, there are three components in each of these chapters. One is on labor, and that most of the time refers to the ILO Declaration of 1998 on the fundamental principles and rights at work, the 8 core conventions which are listed in there. Then there is a chapter on environmental protection, which makes reference to some of the key international conventions. There's some variation between countries depending on what some of their major sectors which look at specific aspects. So like in the Colombia-Peru agreement, there's quite a bit on forestry because they have a very important forest reserve and about sustainable forest management. And then thirdly, there is a lot of cross-cutting commitments related to the promotion of eco-labels, the promotion of CSR, the development of CSR. Commitment to the OECD guidelines has come up in the Vietnam agreement, and so on. These are the commitments, and they're actually not very precise. It's just the commitment to, for instance, implement the ILO conventions, which are in the declaration, such as freedom of association. In order to see how well the parties are implementing that, the chapter also develops a bit of an institutional mechanism which has to look at how well they are doing. And an important part of that are the so-called domestic advisory groups. So each party has a domestic advisory group consisting of multiple stakeholders who look at how well the EU for the EU DAC or Colombia or Peru for the other ones in the case of the EU-Colombia agreement, how well they are doing with regard to compliance with the standards. These DACs meet regularly. They have a meeting and they report to the Subcommittee on Trade and Sustainable Development, which might take into account reservations, comments, recommendations, and so on. On theory, this is actually quite an interesting system. You have some kind of a bottom-up system of all stakeholders involved who can report to the Trade and Sustainable Development Committee, who might take action or might make commitments to deal with certain issues. That's then also overseen by a civil society dialogue and forum, which brings the DACs from the different trade agreements together, so that you also have some learning effects from what's happening in the EU-Korea agreement, but what's happening in other agreements. Now, here we come into the challenges of this type of approach. Again, you have a nice set of commitments to international conventions, and you have certain mechanisms to monitor. Now, more recently, actually quite independently, a few of my colleagues and also we in Leuven, we started to look at these DACs and these institutional mechanisms to look at how well they are operating. And what we found is that actually, while on paper they look like an interesting instrument, it's not really working in practice. And there are a lot of operational failings, we call them. There are a lot of issues related to lack of resources, too few meetings, unclear what the precise nature of the outcome of the meetings of these DACs is, how it can be followed up, and so on. Actually, all coming a bit to the conclusion that on paper there's a very nice new instrument created, but if you look at the real developments in practice, it's not really working. And I think the most important thing is that the overall purpose and function of this type of institutional mechanism is unclear. If you have these types of stakeholder meetings, what, if there are issues identified, what comes out of it? What can be done? So in that sense, I think, and it's something the Commission is also very aware of, they need to rethink how they follow up these commitments in the trade and sustainable development chapters. A very important issue there is that if, for instance, when it comes to the trade chapters in a trade agreement, and there's some kind of complaint or there's some kind of disagreement, you potentially can go to a dispute settlement body to resolve it. In the case of the Sustainable Development chapter, that's exempt from that mechanism. And actually there's not really a system to follow up any non-compliance. Potentially there can be an expert group created, but that has never happened. And it's also a far weaker instrument to address issues. So I think one of the things which need to be addressed to strengthen these chapters, to strengthen what the role is of these DACs in this whole system, especially giving specific types of functions to what these DACs can do. Are they formally involved in monitoring? Can they file a complaint? Do they have any reporting duties and so on? And also to make sure that DACs are not constructed out of just self-selected NGOs, but you have a whole system in place which makes it representative. Another challenge currently with the Sustainable Development chapters is that, as I said in the beginning, you will find a lot of the same language in all the agreements. But now a lot of labor rights issues or environmental issues are not the same in all countries. And if you remain on the level of very general commitments, it will become very difficult to address specific issues in a country. So I think what we call the common formulation approach, where there are no clear priorities, might need to be revised. And there should be far more clear commitments which can be monitored throughout time to see how well one complies with these commitments. Another aspect of this whole monitoring process is maybe also to consider the further involvement of what we call multilateral bodies, because in the end, the ILO, when it comes to ILO conventions or other international organizations, have quite a bit of knowledge and information on what the issues are in a country and how they might be addressed. Finally, as we saw with the GSP system, there's the whole issue of what would be appropriate sanctions and how can they be obtained. We should not always think about stopping an agreement because one economic sector is not playing by the books, but we might think more creatively on how to deal with these issues. So you see there are two instruments. They are a bit different in design, but same in objectives. But the shortcomings are, let's say, to a certain degree in parallel in the sense that there's too little or too weak monitoring, too little or too weak sanctioning, or not, let's say, differentiated sanctioning enough. In the end, resulting to very relatively little implementation of the commitments which are in the agreements. So, is the EU leading the way? I said yes and no, and maybe I've stressed a little bit too much so far the no. Why do I say still yes, in the sense that the EU, we should not forget, has a very strong commitment to pursue non-trade objectives to its trade policy. And in that sense, it's really leading in the world. It has a very ambitious agenda on that sense. And it tries to implement it systematically, these objectives in its two policy instruments. And sometimes we as researchers, once we start to focus on a specific policy instrument, we might get a bit too narrow and then think, well, this is not working and that's not working and that should be improved. But we should also be fair and we should also be realistic. We cannot expect from one policy instrument, from one actor, to change, in this case, some of the most severe situations in countries. There are many more factors in play, and we cannot expect of one trade instrument to address all of them. I also say yes because of the current situation a bit. And I promised you the photo of Trump with his Rasputin, his spin doctor Steve Bannon, who is now traveling in Europe, to make a movement here to pursue his agenda. And don't be mistaken about it, his agenda is very much protectionistic, nationalistic, and so on. And he phrased it very well in an interview with The Economist last year. He invited The Economist for an interview, and he said the reason why he invited us was to talk to the enemy. He said, you are the enemy. You are support a radical idea. Free trade, I mean, that's a radical idea. And when we talk about trade, we have mentioned quite a bit that trade has a lot of negative consequences. But we should also not forget that trade creates a lot of economic development, gets a lot of people out of poverty, and it's not a one-sided story. And I think if we think about trade, I think we have to think in terms of that we need trade, but we need it in a sustainable way, and that we need to address the negative effects of trade. And in addressing the negative effects of trade, that does not mean stopping with trade, but that means doing trade differently. And that's what the EU tries to do through these instruments, and that's why I think, in a way, it's leading the way. I say no, partially based on most aspects of my talk, is that the way the EU is currently trying to operationalize this ambitious agenda of pursuing a sustainable trade is, in my view, creating a lot of expectations it will not be able to meet. And that might actually create, in the long term, negative effects. The way the GSP system is currently designed, the way the EU is going about trade agreements and the social and environmental issues involved there, it's just too weak in terms of the commitments which are in there and how the commitments should be complied with. So from that perspective, I don't think that they are leading the way, but of course we should welcome, and they started already to do that, to reflect on how we can do it better. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Axel, for an excellent presentation. I will give some comments to this, and I have a perspective of a lawyer, I would say, and not so much an expert on EU external affairs, but rather EU internally. And that can be a disadvantage, but I think that can also be an advantage, because it makes it possible to also compare how EU works internally, and maybe that can explain why it's not working perfectly externally. I would also say that I represent the Center for European Studies in Lund, and I think this kind of lecture and discussion is very relevant for that center, because it actually connects to an ongoing debate regarding the policy of the European Union when it comes to trade. So I think it's good that we are relating to reality also, and I want to say that. So my main points will be some general observation. There is always a problem if you do this before the lecture, of course. It's not as easy to adapt directly to it as it is if you do nothing, but I thought it could be a good idea to have a PowerPoint. And I will focus most on trade agreement, the second part of Axel's presentation, and I will go towards that kind of conclusion that Axel drew. And one thing, and that is just to, when we compare different actors on the global scene, we should know that EU and the US is of course not really comparable. They are the two biggest ones, even if the US is not very active when it comes to agreement presently. I'm coming to that as well. But that because EU is not a state, right? So it's 28 member states, and what EU can do externally depends on the powers the European Union has. And the EU has strong powers. That was very clearly pointed out by Axel as well regarding commercial policies. But we also have a history that trade was just trade, right? So sustainable development and human rights, etc., was not part of it from the beginning. And that affects a little bit how the competencies of the European Union looks like today. And the EU external competence mirrors also the internal competence. So I'm coming to that. So what the EU can do internally, they can do more or less external as well, but not more. And when it comes to external competence outside the traditional trade area, then there is, even if there are very nice phrases in the treaties, the power is not so strong. It's more words, it's more on the paper than in practice, and I think Axel illustrated that. It has been much better after the Lisbon Treaty, coming to that as well, the latest development in the European Union, where the trade policy has been broadened, but it's still not covering everything to the same extent. So what I will start with, because we talk about labor rights and protection of social rights, etc., and we should know something about the development in the European Union about that. And that is something we call the social Europe, which has been a dilemma for the European Union forever, actually, and still there is that kind of dilemma. And that is because the European Union started with the common market, now the internal market, and that is a very economic project, right? So economic integration is the main thing, is prioritized in the treaty. And then it has changed over the years to be something much broader, but we still have that core. And in the Union there have been reaction to this, and there still are reaction to this. We had in 1989 there was a European Statute of Social Rights, and then the Social Protocol, and next to the Maastricht Treaty in 1993 was some member states who thought that this is becoming too economic, and it should be also more social issues involved. And that you can say, but after that we can see a more cautious development, and that's coming from also strong defenders of these social issues, like Sweden and Germany, for instance, that when it comes to giving away powers to the European Union, they are less enthusiastic about this, right? So there is something called the open method of coordination, and that is something which is more cosmetic in a way. It can happen, but it still depends on a separate cooperation in a way between all the member states in the Union, and the Union is not deciding anything. So if we look at social policies, if we want to do something in the European Union, we normally need a unanimous vote in the Council. The Parliament is involved, but not as involved as in other areas. So it's still not as a European policy as other more economic policies. Subsidiarity is also important for the European Union. We should not bring in things that the member state can do themselves. And social policy is an area where the member state thinks that they can do most of it themselves, and they will block a development with that, change that. So that is internally. I give you just two examples of this as well, and I think it's quite famous examples. So most of you have heard maybe of something called the Laval case. It's very, very discussed in Sweden, and that is connected to the posting of workers. So a service provider in one country can bring a working force and provide services in another country, and in that way you can take workers and pay them less than is then the present level for the salary in the host state. And in this case the host state was Sweden, and the level of pay was quite high, and this Latvian company could then perform the services to a lower price, and that was not popular, so it was trade union actions, etc. But I'm not going into the details, it's just to illustrate that in this case it was a very big difference between what the Eastern Europe thought about this and the Western Europe. It was clearly divided, and it has been the same after that, because now this posting of workers directive has been changed, and there have been two groups in Europe all the time. So we have a divided Europe. That's my point. Another example, and you don't have to go to the details, I can just explain it. That is the latest public procurement directives. And you can also see that when it's comes to public procurement, there is so often the question of economic efficiency on the one hand, and then you have other values on the other hand. So you have similarities with global trade. And the union always put this together in a way. That is how it works. So you should be as efficient as possible and make it possible for everyone to bid in a public procurement. And then you should also think about environmental, social and labor law, etc., to respect that. But it's always balancing. We don't know really the answer, what you can do. We have one objective, which is on the one hand, and another objective on the other hand, and we have to balance this because they have the same value according to union law. And balancing means that we have to use the famous principle of proportionality when we look at this internally. So it's another example, but very clear when it comes to this balancing. I think that this also affects what a union can do externally, because we have the same kind of competencies, externally as internally. So if there is weak competencies when it comes to social issues internally, it will be that also externally. And after the Lisbon Agreement, the trade policy was broadened. There has been discussion, questions about how broad is it. We need an interpretation of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg to be sure. And that came quite clearly from one case, which is a very important one now, and that is an opinion from the European Court of Justice regarding the agreement between EU and Singapore. And we can see from the paragraphs here that, and this is about sustainable development, that kind of chapter in the agreement with Singapore. And in the first paragraph I quote, 164, the court said, it is true that the exclusive competence of the European Union, that they can negotiate themselves and decide for themselves as a union, cannot be exercised in order to regulate the levels of social and environmental protection in the parties' respective territories. So that the union cannot do itself, and that means actually if the union wants to do that, it has to bring all the member states on board. So if that kind of agreement will take effect, it will be what we call a mixed agreement, because that is shared competence. Mixed agreement means that there is more need than a qualified majority in the council. It will be a unanimous vote depending on the policies, but also that every state can then ratify the agreement because they are parties to the agreement. And one example where we can see that that can be cumbersome was the CETA agreement with Canada. We have a regional parliament in Belgium, Wallonia, right, who voted down that themselves. So not even a whole parliament in one member state was needed to block actually an international trade agreement. So you can understand that the Commission wants to put everything from the agreement in the exclusive competence, because then it will be much easier to conclude it. For what was important in the Singapore agreement was that the Court of Justice, and that was in the opposite direction from the Advocate General, who had the opinion before, said that the special chapter on sustainable agreement didn't intend to regulate the levels of social and environmental protection in the parties' respective territory, but to govern trade between the European Union and the Republic of Singapore. So it was the provisions in the treaty was weak enough to be included in trade policy, and therefore they could be then covered by the exclusive competence of the European Union. But if they had been more powerful, that would have been outside the scope of the exclusive competence, and then we must have this as a mixed agreement and a more complicated process. There were other provisions in the treaty which was not covered by the exclusive competence, and that was especially investor dispute settlements, etc. Therefore, the whole agreement was still mixed, and the Commission then produced two different agreements after this, one for the investor treatment, and one for the more pure trade issues. And one is mixed and one is exclusive competence. So it shows how complicated it can be for the European Union to act on the global scene. Right? This is just to give a kind of picture how the union perspective actually for trade agreements, especially in the past, maybe it changed a little bit. But what the trade agreement has been called before, it's the external dimension of the internal market. Right? So you have the internal market, you have the economic and monetary union is the core of the European Union, but everyone is not part of that, not Sweden, for instance. That's why I mentioned it's a separate field here. And after that, we have the internal market, the European Union, that we belong. And then the Union, in a way, export the rules to neighborhood countries like the EA, with Norway, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. They have a couple of hundreds agreements with Switzerland to make the internal market extended to cover also Switzerland. And then they have the third countries after that as a next zone. And there we have the CETA agreement, for instance, with Canada then, and the recent agreement with Japan, etc., and all the bilateral agreement we have been talking about so far. And the Union tried to then export what they have internally, also externally. And I think to some extent this dilemma between social policies and more commercial policies will automatically be affected also when it comes to the content in this agreement and how binding these provisions are. All over we have the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the Union and the member states are part of the WTO as well. So this is all, in a way, different levels in the field of world trade. So why then the Union has a more promotional approach, and that will be the softer approach towards a third country, especially when it comes down to bilateral agreement. And I think that the competence issue, which I call it then, that the Union has no clear competence to conclude the agreement to the same extent as the US, for instance, because they don't have that issue. I mean, the state is going abroad and conclude new agreement. They don't have to think about that. They are a representative for 28 states. Right? So that can explain the approach to some extent. And the possible divided Europe when it comes to social issue, they will also affect the possibility of concluding mixed agreement, because we know that we are not really, in Europe, we are not united. The member state has not the same view when it comes to these questions. And I think that can also argue that for that a pre-ratification condition, and Axel mentioned that as well, meaning that actually before you conclude an agreement, you will put as a requirement on the third country that they will respect other international law, like the ILO conventions, etc., and other human rights conventions, etc. That is easier for the European Union because they don't have to bring that content into the trade agreement itself. So that they have strong powers during the negotiation process, and maybe the union should be more patient than when they negotiate this kind of agreements in the future. The policy coherent issue, I should also mention, that has been also problematic for a long time in the European Union. Internally, but of course also externally. But that has been improved, at least on paper, after the Lisbon Treaty, that there are requirements on coherence for every policy. And that can be improved further, I think, especially when it comes to funds and humanitarian aids, etc., that they are in the same direction as trade policy in general. So that is something which can be better from the European Union side. Yes, and that was more about the European Union, and I want to mention one more thing, and that is that we still must think about the multilateral system as well, because now actually what's happening here, and this is my picture of Trump, and President-elected Trump then says that US will quit the Trans-Pacific Partnership, etc. President Donald Trump has threatened to withdraw the US from the World Trade Organization, claiming it threats his countries unfairly. Yeah, and the trade war with China and the EU about steel and cars, etc. With a lot of tariffs. So you know about that, but it's a new tendency, of course, in the world. It's the biggest threat since 70 years, I've read, for instance. So this is something very new, actually, happening. I think what the European Union is doing now is that they take the advantage of this. So they are a very popular trading partner for other countries in the world, and quite important trading countries. But that means also that we're going in the direction, right, of a more bilateral, divided world. Right? It's not a unilateral system, and that can actually be problematic on longer terms. So some final observations, and that is related to that. EU concludes presently many bilateral trade agreements, and they are very proud of that, and think that now they have a chance, etc. Then the US is a bit absent. But we also have, that will also strengthen actually the tendency that we have no global legal order. Right? We have no real trust in the world itself. We have not very much respect for the rules at the moment, because there are some clear violations of the WTO from the US, for instance. They just ignore it because the sanctions is not powerful enough on the global level. And I think there is a need also for this multilateralism. And ILO, of course, mentioned is very multilateral. 187 member states, actually, are parties to the ILO conventions. Maybe not all of them, but ILO as such. Global standards on corporate social responsibility, like the ISO 26000, is one example of more private initiative to make something globally, to connect this to social issues, but it will be for the companies themselves to sign up for this. And we should not forget about the WTO. It's 164 members, and that is a very large amount, of course, of countries. And that is also problematic because you need consensus to change it. So it has been very difficult to change the WTO. But there is work ongoing to reform the WTO as well, and the European Union is working towards that. But that is also important, beside this bilateral agreement, to have this global level playing field. And maybe this is a naive proposal. It's not really a proposal, but in the WTO there is sustainable development recognized, something important. And if one state can show that we have some trade barriers because of this policy about sustainable development. They can block trade from another partner, so there is a justification ground possible in the WTO, but there are no real chapters about sustainable development. But if we reform the WTO, maybe that is something that should be included there, because if you put this on a global level, that would be more ideal, according to me. Because otherwise, and that is my last point I mentioned there, labor standards in these bilateral treaties, there can also be sometimes a risk that they put fair competition at risk, right? Because if you have trade possibilities according to the WTO, and you have to have a little bit better possibilities, you have to have an agreement with the European Union, for instance. Then if you have to also invest a lot in social protection, that can also cost something, and that can affect the price on the goods, etc. And then the ones who will not do that, who will not have this bilateral agreement, is still covered by the WTO, they can have a competition advantage. So this, if we put it more globally, this kind of requirements, of course, we will also handle this issue about global competition in a better way. So I stop there, and I let the other speakers come in and give comments and continue this very interesting seminar. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Axel and Jürgen, for painting this rich picture for us. Very interesting observations. We were a bit optimistic with the time, but that was worth. We have roughly 15 minutes, maybe a bit more, for comments and questions. So the floor is yours now. Who wants to start? Sophie. We can collect 2-3 questions at once. We have one here, another one there, 3 questions there. Please speak up loudly in the microphone, because we'll try to get this recording to pick up your questions from the audience as clearly as possible. Please, Sophie.
Yeah, my name is Sophie. I'm a sociology student here for the Welfare Policy Management Program. I have like a whole bunch of questions because I think it's very interesting. But I'll try to limit it a little bit. The whole list first, maybe about all the conventions that the countries from the GSP assignments have. All the European member states signed all of these conventions themselves before they ask other countries or their trade partners to live up to these. I think that's very interesting to see how if they're living up to it themselves as well, and also if there are all these mechanisms and all these different things that they're expecting from their trade partners, how does the European Union member states actually live up to these themselves? And then I was thinking about as the let me see here. Yes, as the markets outside of Europe are expanding and growing stronger, how effective will these value-based trade agreements be if people can just trade with each other without having to live up to these, human rights standards and all these things that the European Union want them to live up to? And is there not a risk that the European Union is willing to sort of really lower these standards to be part of that market of having a need to trade with China about certain things, or having a need to trade with countries that doesn't want to or cannot or will not live up to the standards that the European Union are setting? And is there examples where Europe then decides maybe not to go through with sanctions or not to go through, remove countries from all these lists because they need the trade partner? So that was. And then finally, where are all the multinational companies in this in terms of protecting the change in the lower, in the value chain, in terms of European companies that are what do you say, like rely on products that are, you know, from the chains below them. That were my comments and questions.
It's kind of similar to one perspective you mentioned. So basically, I think for the question is...
You need to turn it on.
Okay.
In the bottom. Underneath it.
Speak to more you're far away.
Underneath in the bottom.
Hidden bottom.
So I think for the question, is EU leading the way for free and fair trade? Like my answer would be yes, but both in the sense that EU has been working kind of really hard in terms of using those non-trade methods to improve like human rights or labor rights in quite a lot developing countries, but also because compared with China and the US, of course you're leading. Like it's not really any match to difficult to win. So my question, not really question, like it's more about but you can't really ignore China and the US. So for example, China, like the massive re-educational concentration camp on the Uyghur people, and also the recent worker movement in Shenzhen. So those kind of things, like both EU or WTO hasn't really been doing anything about it. I'm sorry if it sounds too political, but that's my first reaction to the presentation. And thank you so much.
My name is Ingrid Sidenvalgego. I'm from a company called 2050, and I was previously with the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development in Geneva. So first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the very interesting presentations. Now, I have more experience in working with the trade and environment intersection, and in that area, there's a bit of a difference between how the EU treats environment compared to the US, and now I refer to like the old US before Trump, where the EU would go for very broad but non-enforceable commitments or pledges when it comes to environmental protection. And the US would rather go for something a bit more narrow but more enforceable. Now, what I understood from the presentation is that the EU is very ambitious when it comes to human rights and trade, and trying to really cover a lot. But what I also understand is that they seem to be having a mixed outcome when it comes to how the trading partners respect the obligations. And the strategy that the EU has gone for is to put in place this institutional mechanism with the DAGs and so on. But it seems to me that they're actually doing a bit more of the same. So they continue on this non-enforceable route. And now, from hearing from the discussant, I think I know better why. But so my question is, has there been a discussion in the EU whether to try something different? So rather than to continue to aim for this very broad but very soft approach, has there been a discussion whether they should go for something a bit more narrow and more enforceable?
Thank you. Okay, you have the mics here.
I think you better start.
I better start, all right. Thank
See
you
if I
very
can add
much.
something.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for excellent questions and remarks. So, Sophie, on a few of your points, have all EU member states signed all conventions? I've not checked them all, but I think most EU member states signed all of these conventions. But the broader or the more a general point you make is a very important one, is that, of course, not all EU countries implement these conventions. What I showed you about Colombia, about this compliance gap between legal ratification and de facto implementation, we might observe similar things with some EU member states. And of course, the EU is quite vulnerable also on that respect, and I guess that it often pops up in discussions that the EU is also not always living up to these commitments. But from the perspective of a trade agreement, that might actually be a way for some NGOs to empower them to also hold EU member states to account for the commitments which are in there. So in my talk, I focused a lot on the impact on third countries. But of course, in a bilateral agreement, which is reciprocal, it will also have effects on what's happening in the EU. And there you come actually very close in the direction of the talk you did on the internal policies and the social policies, and you will touch on very sensitive issues when it comes to, for instance, freedom of association, on collective bargaining, and other issues. So, yeah, the EU has certainly also an issue there. On how it plays out outside the EU, and that the EU might lower their standards not to lose out trade, that might be the case. That's actually one of the concerns why the EU wants to promote this social and environmental agenda, not to have this type of race to the bottom. But you should not forget that the EU, China and the US are by far the strongest trading partners. Also, the US, not now under Trump, but more in general, also tries to pursue this, for a certain degree, normative agenda through trade. They have labor chapters in trade agreements, they have environmental chapters in trade agreements. So in that sense, they actually follow the EU quite a bit. And some might say that they go much further. If you saw the drafts of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that had what they call labor consistency plans, which made that some of the countries involved in the partnership agreement had to implement changes in labor law before the partnership agreement could take effect. So the US sometimes goes much further into that. So I don't see an immediate risk that the EU would lose out on that. There's another issue to the point you made, which I personally find interesting, is the question about when we talk about the effectiveness of this agenda of the EU, we tend to focus on what is the impact of these provisions and an agreement on the ground. But one of the questions I'm getting interested in is what is the impact of, let's say, more the discourse of integrating human rights and sustainable development in trade agreements? How is that affecting how other parties conclude trade agreements? So to make it concrete, in the EU-Korea agreement, there's a sustainable development chapter to which South Korea need to comply, and the EU. But it's an interesting question as what is South Korea subsequently doing in their trade negotiations with other countries. We assume that they don't address environmental issues, but I'm actually not sure. We see that a lot of non-EU countries are also, to a certain degree, integrating environmental and labor issues in trade agreements. It might actually be interesting to look further how this EU model might be actually diffusing further rather than isolating the EU. And then the final thing on the question on the companies, for me they are a little bit, how should I say, the missing link in this whole story. That's why I try to emphasize a bit that it's always by the Commission and states, GSP, trade agreement and so on. But when we talk about living up to social and environmental standards, it's really economic actors and companies which need to comply. And that remains very much undeveloped in the EU policy. And in the strategy for all, there's actually more emphasis on corporate social responsibility. using voluntary instruments to promote companies to act more sustainable and so on. But it has not really been integrated in these instruments. One more radical idea might be, for instance, in the GSP scheme, that one would consider that in order to be eligible for the GSP preferences, that companies might need labels to export, which would provide a proof that they are operating sustainably. These debates they are emerging a bit there, but that's not really being taken up by the EU, and the EU is not really pushing this type of agenda further. On your question with China, if you compare the EU policies compare it to China, of course the EU is leading the way. But my answer to the question, I just wanted to balance that, to say that the EU has a very ambitious agenda on promoting sustainable development and human rights to trade, and in that way they're definitely leading the way. But my hesitation towards let's say, full positive answer is just that the way they are doing that might not generate the results they are intending to have as they are put on paper. So it's a bit on how you interpret the question and from which perspective you compare it. Then the final question on other instruments is a very interesting one. And there's actually a third type of trade instrument which I did not discuss today, but which the EU is using. And that's what we call market access instruments. And these are instruments which the EU uses to regulate what comes on their market and to promote environmental aspects through that. And there are a few examples. The most prominent example is the regulation on the prohibition of the selling of illegal timber on the European market. In order to access the European market, you need to be able, as a timber exporter, to prove that the timber was harvested legally. And that actually includes, for many countries, also sustainability concerns. And if you cannot prove that, you cannot enter the market. And the EU actually has, in complement to that regulation, actually preceding that regulation, set up a whole system which is called FLEGT, Forest Law Enforcement Governance System, which actually tries to be far more, let's say, not promotional, but demanding in terms of forest management of some countries, thinking of Indonesia, Ghana, and so on, to make sure that their forest governance systems are working properly, and that in order, if they achieve that, they get some kind of a green card to export to the EU. And that's a system which is far more demanding, which is also far more monitored in terms of really reaching environmental objectives, and which is working much better. But the big issue there is that it concerns the level to which these types of instruments can be duplicated to many countries, because for the moment, FLEGT and the timber regulation are a bit of a success story, but only limited to a certain number of countries, because the capacity to run these types of schemes, which go much further in terms of achieving environmental protection, are far more demanding, far more costly, and require far more capacity to have them operate. Something similar, but that's just now in development, is the conflict minerals regulation, which will require companies to put in place due diligence systems for exporting minerals to the EU. And that's not only minerals in terms of diamonds, but talking about the components of mobile phones and so on. And that might also have a much stronger implications, and might be actually more suitable instruments to achieve some of these social and environmental objectives. But the conflict minerals one, that's currently in implementation, and will only be up and running in, I think, 21, 22, and then we'll be able to assess how that's working.
Thank you. Yes, it's working, yes. Yeah, I don't think I have so much to add to this very complete answer. China was mentioned by several. I think it was very good points raised in your questions in general. I think that also confirms a little bit what I try to say when we talk about the competence problem. Of course, that is just one explanation why the EU cannot act more forcefully on the global scene. I think one other reason, as strong, would be that we have the WTO. China is party to the WTO since 2008. Russia is party since 2012. So if the EU would ignore China and then have more preferences for other trading parties, which they have bilateral agreement, they would violate also WTO law. And that is a legal argument. The other argument is, of course, the economic one. No, Europe cannot afford ignoring China. So we have this kind of balancing, and that's why I said also that I think that if we can put these issues on the global level at the top, and that would be the WTO, but that of course is extremely difficult with all the negotiations, etc., then it would be an ideal situation, because then everyone would have to respect it more globally, and that would also change a little bit the pattern of competition in the world. But today it's a kind of dilemma. You cannot do everything in a bilateral agreement, and you can actually make it more difficult for your trading partners if you're pushing too hard. And I think that is a reason for the EU to be softer. And I think when the US is harder, I cannot be sure about that, of course, but it can also be because it benefits themselves more. So if they limit to some special issues, it can also be that it's about protecting America and have the chance of protecting if something happens. It's not only to help the rest of the world, so to speak.
More questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Eileen Fonske. I work at the Danish Institute for Human Rights on business and human rights related issues. What I was reflecting on is that you're presenting broadly two sets of let's say, the way the EU imposes or encourages human rights trade. One is conditionality, when you suggest that if they're not respecting human rights, then you would withdraw trade preferences. Whereas I think what we see with the chapters around sustainable development is more around looking at the effects of trade on human rights. So these are sort of two different logics. And on the second one, which is the one that interests me more, I'd like to hear your reflections around how are these chapters also used by others, because obviously the European Union has itself conflicting interest, and it is very much, I believe, the effect of a civil society advocacy, etc., that they have included such chapters in the trade agreements. But of course, the first objective of trade agreements is trade, and there's a lot of economic interest there. But to what extent are those chapters used by others than only civil society in Europe to be actually addressing some of the issues that you have been talking about? For example, European multinationals being involved in human rights abuses in those countries, and to what extent do you see any states or civil society outside of the EU that are actually using that chapter for their own self-interest and to maybe gain safeguards, not open certain industries to investments, etc.? Or is it, only a sort of wish of northern civil society that this is an instrument through which we can address some of the effects of trade on human rights?
Let's get an answer to this question. We take them one by one now.
If you mean use these chapters outside the EU, what do you mean? Who are you thinking of who should use these chapters?
Well, first and foremost, I would think about the negotiators in third states. Because they might be able to gain something from that in terms of, we cannot liberalize the I don't know, health sector, because this might cause,
Mhm.
you know, a lot of human rights effects, negative ones. So, you know, that could be something that the negotiators could use. Whereas, you know, was very much from the EU's perspective, and not on the other side.
Well, that's an excellent point. There are two things I want to answer to your remark. One is, you should not forget that the Sustainable Development chapters are not only there on the, let's say, demand of civil society actors, but very much on the demand of the European Parliament. Because the European Parliament now has a role to play in these trade agreements, also to get them concluded. And actually the European Parliament, very interesting, across all political parties, demand that sustainable development issues are addressed in trade agreements. So it's quite a broad set of actors who wants them in. Now to the second part of your question and remark, that's a very interesting one, and I don't have an answer to it, but you're very right in the sense that the EU comes with this agenda to a trading partner in the context of a trade negotiations. And the EU wants this essential elements clause in the agreement. The EU wants the trade and sustainable development chapters in the agreement. But what it has to give in on it is unclear, because that's part of the bargaining the EU brings to the table. That it has maybe to give in on concessions on tariffs in certain sectors, some, let's say, offensive interest of a trading partner who wants to export to the EU. That's very well possible, but we don't have any information on it. We have some kind of, let's say, speculation that the EU has to give in on other things in order to have these chapters in. But what that is and what that means in terms of magnitude, that's unclear. Second point there is you always have to take into account in these types of debates what the relative bargaining power of the parties are in such a negotiation. And I think when we talk about negotiating with Colombia and Peru, the EU has much more bargaining power, and I think they have far more leverage to have these chapters in without giving in too much. But when we think about negotiating these types of agreements or chapters or commitments with other parties which are more equal in weight, then that plays out very differently, I think.
Yes, I don't have any clear knowledge about this, but I was thinking when you said it about something we call private enforcement, and that is in competition law, for instance, that actually if you have the law and there are some companies which are not following the law, then there can be others actually raising claims. And then you can construct a system that you don't need just institutional enforcement, that it's possible for these companies to bring claims about it. And that is not happening, I think, today. But if you increase the level of these rules, then that can be something for the future, that you can have this kind of observations from other companies as well. Because I think if we are respecting the rules, the others should as well, otherwise it's not fair competition. So that was something a little bit beside the point, but that was what I was thinking about.
We have time for one last quick question before we vote. Maria, please.
So thanks for this extremely interesting afternoon. I was really interested in the discussion of all the oversight systems and the indicators, what would be used to monitor and evaluate. Because it sounds like right now, from the way you were talking, there's everyone's drawing on everything. They're drawing on the treaty bodies for the UN treaties, they're drawing on the ILO oversight systems, they're drawing on the SDG indicators. That's just an unwieldy mess. Where are we in the process of trying to come up with a coherent single set of indicators or drawing or source of oversight?
I don't think we are very far in that. To be honest, how the Commission uses these different indicators and information and so on, in the case of GSP, is actually not known. They develop what they call their own scorecards for countries, which they use in discussion with these countries, but they don't make them publicly available. So it's not clear what they, for instance, get from the ILO bodies, because you also have in the ILO complaint system and so on, which they can use to monitor compliance with those countries. But what they get from it, how they use it, it's very unclear. And it is clear that they complement that information with, for instance, reports they get from the EU delegations in those countries. And it does not end up into, let's say, a matrix of indicators of how well countries are complying or not. It's more a narrative type of assessment of what are the key issues which need to be addressed. And that's more the type of monitoring which is currently going on. But I don't think there's any, let's say,